Thank you very much for your kind words, Christoph. Yes. When Rasvan asked me to come to this conference and asked for a title, I immediately thought of rebooting ecumenism. I thought perhaps not. And I'm aware that this title might seem a bit curmudgeonly, even downright negative, but bear with me. Rebooting Ecumenism. The title is drawn, I don't need to tell you, from the language of computers. In fact, it's such a recent word that it doesn't appear in the Oxford English Dictionary yet. Rebooting, that is, in any sense, as far as I can see. If your laptop, for instance, stops working, one thing you can try to do is reboot it. That is, switch it off, disconnect it, leave it a bit, and then connect up and try to start it again. If it works, you're fine. If not, then you're in serious trouble. If rebooting works, you're back where you were. And my first hesitation on hearing the title Rebooting Ecumenism is that it suggests that when you have rebooted it, ecumenism will be there as it was before. And I'm not sure that is what any of us would really want. That, however, depends upon what we think is needed. Ecumenism is in difficulty. We've been told that several times yesterday, that ecumenism is having problems, and we can all acknowledge that. But does it just need a reboot, or is the situation more serious? Now, the answer to that question could take many forms. We could pore over the documents that have been produced over the last century in connection with what we call the ecumenical movement, and particularly since the establishment of the World Council of Churches in 1948, which involved, among other things, a merger between two earlier movements marked by a series of conferences: the Faith and Order, concerned with matters of doctrine and church government; Life and Work, concerned with social ministries, international affairs, and relief work. And already in that period there were people who were complaining about separating faith and order from life and work. In the decades since 1948, the World Council of Churches expanded, now incorporating most churches except the Roman Catholic Church, which, however, has established close links with the World Council of Churches short of actual membership. I think that's still the case. That, however, would be a huge task, not to be crammed into 30 minutes or so. One could otherwise tell something of one's own involvement in ecumenism, which might be useful, and what one now thinks about ecumenism. That will be subjective, and it might not be very interesting. Or one might wonder about the term ecumenism and what light that sheds on the enterprise. What I'm going to do is a bit of the last two. I think perhaps I should say something about where I'm coming from when I think about ecumenism, because we all have our own stories, and I suspect our stories are often in many respects rather different. And so if one doesn't come clean, I'm assuming that you know why I'm thinking what I'm thinking. Or one might wonder, and then having revealed my hand, I might go on and say something about my hesitations about the notion of ecumenism. Hesitations that actually extend to the use of the word orthodox and orthodoxy as an ecclesial self-designation. Like many people brought up in a Christian family and used to church going, I had a period of teenage doubt. But by the time I came up to this university, Cambridge, as a 17-year-old to read mathematics, I'd become some kind of committed Anglo-Catholic in Leeds, where I was living, where a range of Anglo-Catholicism was on offer. And if I searched my memory, I could probably tell you something about what was there then. Much of it vanished. At the end of my first term, in December 1962, I went on a day conference in Oxford, in Cambridge, at Little St Mary's, on orthodoxy. And I listened there to the then still clean-shaven Timothy Ware and the Russian layman, Nicholas Zernov, who spoke together, as they often did on these occasions, from the end of the 50s onwards. I cannot remember anything they said, but I must have been fascinated, as when we were told about the Orthodox seminar that took place each year in those days, with a week of lectures and discussion at the Ecumenical Institute at Bossy, near Geneva, followed by Orthodox Holy Week in Paris at the Institut Saint-Serge, I thought I'd see if I could go, and go I did. With a grant from my college to cover fees, costs and travel expenses, if you can believe it. I have lasting impressions from that experience, but they were as much impressions of meeting lots of Christians of different backgrounds, including an impressive elderly French Protestant layman who took me under his wing. My languages were quite inadequate, but all was in English, or mostly so. The fact that I was reading maths at Cambridge was greeted with some amusement. Everybody else was theological in some way. We travelled from Bossy to Paris by coach and stopped at Sens, where I recall that the whole west front of the cathedral was clad in black for a requiem mass and funeral of some local dignitary. It made a great impression, that. The services in Saint-Serge were in Slavonic and largely incomprehensible. Nevertheless, they did make a deep impression that lasted, but was difficult to disentangle. Back in Cambridge, I made many Christian friends, apart from Anglicans, mainly Methodists and Catholics. Ecumenism was lively in the 60s. The Week of Prayer for Christian Unity was a major event, or series of events. And the Anglican Methodist conversations were in progress, and most of those I knew were hopeful of their success. The then Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, was known to be a strong supporter of the conversations. And the failure of those conversations in 1971, by which time I was a chaplain at Worcester College, Oxford, a chaplain at Worcester College, Oxford, was felt as a blow, though I had not expected them to succeed, and my disappointment, if anything, was rather muted. My memory of the 70s and early 80s, when I was in Oxford, is not marked by much local ecumenical activity. Rather, there is a consciousness of the Anglican Roman Catholic conversations with the agreed statements on Eucharist, ministry and authority in the Church that were issued in the 1970s. And I soon had a marginal role, or rather anti-role, first writing commentaries published as pamphlets for the Catholic League, an Anglo-Papalist organisation in which I took an unholy delight, for the statements were easy to criticise given the refuge they sought in vague and unclear compromise. And I sent copies of them, they were published, to two friends who were anarchic, Henry Chadwick and Ted Yarnold. Henry, of course, didn't reply and said nothing, but Ted sent me a card, the gist of which was, "You write very wittily, Andrew, damn you." I had a more formal role in the reception of these statements by the Church of England, as Robert Runcie, then Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed me to be a member of the Faith and Order Advisory Group of General Synod, which was meant to advise General Synod on matters of faith and order. And all the time, while I was on it, we were simply concerned with the series of Archic statements, Archic 1 statements. Being on FOAG, as it called itself, was a dismal experience. I was told actually that the advisory had been added to the title of the group to avoid the acronym FOG. Only a minority of the members had any grasp of the issues addressed by the statements, but it didn't stop them having very strong opinions. It usually felt, or it felt to me usually, that getting agreement of the members of FOAG, all Anglicans, on the statements was more of a challenge than the members of Archic themselves had faced. All that fed into my growing disillusion about Anglicanism, but that's another story. Other ecumenical engagements that I might mention that I participated in, but one for me stands out, and that is in 2001, I was asked to be a member of a colloquy consisting of European Orthodox and Catholic patristic scholars who met and still meet every other year to discuss, as patristic scholars, but as believers, is some important theological topic, beginning with God the Father, and in 2023, breaking our routine of doctrinal topics, we took as our subject the First Council of Nicaea. We're one of the first of this long train of events celebrating Nicaea that I don't think really have come to an end. At our 10th conference in 2021, I was asked by Teresa Heinthaler, who was then the convener, to say something as one of the Orthodox members about what I thought we had achieved. And in that address I said this: perhaps more important than the pronouncements of negotiations between our several churches, we issued a press statement after each conference. We have over the years come to know one another as scholars, as believers, and also as friends. The creation of bonds of friendship between members of different churches seems to me as important as any formal agreement about issues that divide us. And what we have achieved on a small scale is but part of a larger movement that has characterised the last century. And I went on also to mention the Oxford Patristic Conferences, founded by Canon Leslie Cross in 1951, which continued every 4 years, which have continued every 4 years, only broken a bit by COVID, and were continued after his death by his secretary, Betsy Livingston. Those 4-year conferences have been, for me at any rate, a vital contact with ecumenism. You'll see that for me, ecumenism has various manifestations, some more cogent than others. I was caught up in the enthusiasm for ecumenism in the 1960s, and I shared the disappointment of the failure of the Anglican Methodist conversations. Thereafter, I was not much moved by the manifestation of ecumenism found in the agreed statements, of which the archic statements were the most prominent, at least for Anglicans. Such ecumenism provided an excuse for discussions in which one met people of different Christian allegiances and engaged seriously with their ways of thinking, and also of praying together. Such enterprises as archic spawned ventures such as the Orthodox Catholic Patristic Colloquy, set up on the initiative of the French patristic scholar Isabelle d'Andia, whose inspiration was the appeal by Pope John Paul II, quoting the words of Vyacheslav Ivanov, for the Church once again to breathe with both its lungs. Now, throughout this paper, and continuing throughout this paper, more or less unavoidably, I've used the term ecumenism, but I have reservations about that I shall try to explore a little. First of all, let me summarise my impressions from my own life my impressions from what I've told you about my experiences of ecumenism. It's not that ecumenism failed to achieve anything, though without the Second Vatican Council, it seems to me that little would have been achieved. But that council was hardly one of the objectives of the ecumenical movement. Ecumenism has achieved a great deal, but it has not achieved what it set out to achieve. The result of ecumenical conversations has been, it seems to me, a change of mood rather than any discernible steps towards visible unity. In fact, it is my impression that the failure to achieve the goals that ecumenism seemed to be pursuing has led to abandoning, or at least putting on the back burner, the goal of visible unity and settling for something apparently achievable. Earlier this autumn, I was invited to take part in an ecumenical gathering for Christians from the north of England, celebrating the Council of Nicaea in Blackburn. It's a curious occasion because Blackburn is in the northwest of England, whereas I live in the northeast of England, and for us up there, the difference in the northwest and the northeast is actually about as great as the difference between north and south. There were lectures with responses and discussions, and then seminars, one of which was on Nicaea, led by a group of scholars of distinction, such as the Dominican Aidan Nichols and Sister Margaret Adkins, and it's also me, in which we seemed to find a common mind, at least on the different routes that led from Nicaea. we'd be given a list of points to address, one of which struck me, and it's this. We were asked to consider the statement that the gold standards of ecumenism will be the achievement of intercommunion, which seemed to me to be a real step back from the ideals we were pursuing in the 1960s, where intercommunion, that is sharing in communion with other Christians with whom we are not in communion, was a much disputed step towards our goal, not the goal itself. In doing that, making it the goal, adopting what seems to be an achievable goal of intercommunion, we would be, it seems to me, abandoning much of the vision of the earlier apostles of ecumenism, such as Paul Couturier, for whom the prayer ut unum sint was paramount as a prayer, for if Christian unity is to be realized, it will not be the result of human plans and negotiations, but received as an answer to prayer. Ecumenism. I said a few minutes ago that I'd explore a little my reservations about that term. As is made clear on the World Council of Churches logo, ecumenical is derived from the Greek word ekumene, which means the inhabited world. On the World Council of Churches logo, it's a kind of bit over the top, transliterated into Latin. The term ecumene is not found in the Septuagint, for instance. It doesn't really belong to the Christian vocabulary of the Church. It belongs, really, to the terminology of the Roman Empire and expresses its conviction, false, indeed hubristic, that the whole inhabited world was extensive with the Roman Empire. Outside the borders of the Roman Empire, there were simply uncivilized people, unable to speak properly. Barbarian is onomatopoeic. It is first used in a Christian context as a designation for church councils or synods that were endorsed by the emperor. They were called by the emperor, and their decisions carried the weight of imperial law. All this we've been told time and again over the last year, as we have celebrated the First Ecumenical Synod held in Nicaea in 325. The Church found it easy to endorse this gift of ecumenical status because its own purpose laid upon it in what came to be known as the Great Commission is to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the fulfillment of the age. It's a curious fact that the mission of the Church in the patristic age, and really to the end of the first millennium, was to the cities and provinces that belonged to or had belonged to the Roman Empire. It is the Church of the East that took the gospel along the silk routes. It was the Syrian Orthodox Church that claimed Thomas as their apostle. Churches, that is, that refused to accept the Ecumenical Synod of Chalcedon, and in reality accepted only one council, Nicaea, as the council of the Church, that did not need the sobriquet ecumenical. These churches had a point for the endorsement of the mighty Roman Empire conferred by the term ecumenical, ecumenikos, imposed a limitation on the Church, which had been given from the Lord a mission to make disciples of pandata ethnic, all the nations. The Roman Empire was indeed a multi-ethnic empire, but it wasn't omni-ethnic. I've often wondered why the term ecumenical came to be applied to the 20th century movement for Christian unity. And they must have been written about somewhere, but I've never come across anything. The earliest uses of the English word given in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, place the word ecumenical, sometimes prefaced by an O, so to represent properly the the Omicron iota of the first two words of ecumenikos, ecumenical, in apposition to universal, in other words, meaning the same sort of thing. And the earliest examples will go back to the 16th century. Include, for instance, the term ecumenical patriarch applied to the Bishop of Constantinople. Glossing the word by universal suggests what is going on. Finding a bland equivalent for universal, and thereby avoiding the ecclesial term for universal, which is katholikos, Catholic. I think Yves Congar pointed out long ago that ecumenical is an attempt to avoid using the word Catholic, though I've not been able to locate it among the multitude of his writings. Ecumenical, I would argue, is a diminishment of Catholic, leaning on the Roman state for its validity, not on the Church's own understanding of itself, where Catholicos means not just universal, but truth as universal. It is, to use a distinction we made something of yesterday, not quantitative, but qualitative. As Henri de Lubac put it in his book called Catholicism, the Church is not Catholic by being actually spread across the whole surface of the earth and by counting a great number of adherents. She was already Catholic on the morning of Pentecost, when all her members fitted into a small room. Catholic in the period when the Arian waves appeared to overwhelm her. Catholic still tomorrow, if massive apostasies were to make her lose almost all her faithful. And Vladimir Lossky, somewhat more expansively, is in agreement with de Lubac here. The term Catholic in Christian use designates the truth that flows from the gospel, and because true, therefore universal, not a merely personal or local opinion. As Lossky puts it, Catholicism then shows itself to us as an inalienable mark of the Church in virtue of her possession of the truth. One can see why Catholic was evaded and ecumenical used instead to describe what the World Council of Churches was about. Because the word Catholic has actually been ceded by most of the churches to those churches in communion with Rome. Unless you think I'm just being tiresomely anti-ecumenical, let me assure you that what I would say the same thing about the avoidance of Catholic as a self-designation of the Church by the word of the Orthodox Church by the word Orthodox, or in many parts of the Orthodox Church by translating Catholicos in the Creed as Soborni, however imaginative such a translation might be, rather than transliterating it. All this you might say is irrelevant. When I use the word Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, it means whatever I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. So you might say with ecumenism, it doesn't matter where it comes from, but where we choose to mean it. But Alice was right to have doubts in her conversation with Humpty Dumpty. Words have a history, and that history trails them, and especially, I think, a history of evasion. Instead of rebooting ecumenism, we need to reinvent it, and probably give it another name, or interpret it in a way that enables it to be infused by the Christian language of the Church as one holy, Catholic and apostolic. And in particular, see the bonds that bind it together as more like bonds of friendship and less like some sort of legal definition. But beyond all that, nothing that we can fashion for ourselves. Say, if we are going to realize the Church as truly one holy, Catholic and apostolic, and all members belonging to that Church, none of this we can fashion for ourselves, but only receive from the Lord of the Church in response to our prayer. Thank you.